Good evening and welcome. It is such a joy to see so many beautiful, wonderful faces here at the Church of the Covenant this evening. I am Reverend Melanie Marsh-Baum, Associate Pastor here at Church of the Covenant, and on behalf of the church, I am honored to welcome you all here tonight, to welcome Ms. Davis, and to be the host, that we are the host of the Social Justice, Empathy, and Social Transformation Keynote Address for the third biennial intergenerational think tank. We are so glad to have you here this evening. 2 notes of housekeeping. First, we ask that you silence all cell phones right now, just as we are getting ready to start the evening, and also refrain from taking pictures or recording during the event. I know it's going to be difficult, but please, this event is being recorded professionally and it will be available for viewing later. Please try to remain in the moment and enjoy it while you are here and not record for the future at this time. And once again, welcome. We are so honored that you are all here, and welcome, Ms. Davis.
I'm Cyrus Taylor, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Case Western Reserve University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. You know, it's not possible to open a newspaper, turn on the TV, browse the web, look at Facebook, without a daily reminder of the kind of incidents that are occurring around the country that call into question the basic structure of our society and the direction that we're headed. Locally, Tamir Rice, Tanisha Anderson, the 137 gunshots, all are reminders of a flawed system that seems to be headed often in a very wrong direction. It is in part to try to help address these challenges that Case Western Reserve in 2010 created the Social Justice Institute, headed by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Rhonda Williams. Yes. I'm a huge fan of Dr. Rhonda's. That's why, as I look out on all of you in this place, in this wonderful church this evening, I am delighted to welcome you here to this third biennial intergenerational think tank, Educating for Struggle, Social Justice, Empathy, and Social Transformation. The previous think tanks, Social Justice, Race, and Profiling, and Educating for Struggle in the academy, schools, prisons, and streets, set a high standard that I know will be met and exceeded in this meeting. Taken together with the other work of the Social Justice Institute, it's my fervent hope that the work in this meeting and beyond will go far towards fulfilling part of the mission of the Social Justice Institute, working towards equal access to opportunity for all people through understanding and addressing the root causes of social injustice and developing innovative solutions. Indeed, the Institute, through cooperation, communication, and collaboration, seeks to support innovative and synergistic research, scholarship, and pedagogy, build and support social justice leaders, and forge productive relationships across boundaries within the university and into the community, and our gathering in this place is, I think, a wonderful testament to that. All of these are key elements of the work of this weekend. The issues we are addressing are formidable and central to who we are and who we will be as a society. I know personally that the work often feels like 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, and all too often it feels like 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. This is why events such as this are so important as we wrestle with the challenges of educating for struggle. I thus want to thank all of the participants and attendees for their efforts to these ends, and I especially want to thank the Think Tank 2015 co-sponsors, IdeaStream, Indetta Letson, Sisters of Charity Foundation of Cleveland, the LGBT Community Center of Greater Cleveland, Olivet Institutional Baptist Church, as well as all the offices and programs at Case Western Reserve that have helped make this weekend possible. So welcome to you all, and I look forward to a wonderful and productive meeting that will have an impact on our society. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Rhonda.
So can everybody hear me? All right, how's everybody doing? All right, we got Sister Angela. So greetings, everybody. I'm Dr. Rhonda. That's what my students and my friends and community people have dubbed me. Mama named me Rhonda Y. Williams is my full name, and I'm the founder and director of the Social Justice Institute here at CWRU. With over 1,100 participants in 7 different events, the 2015 Third Biennial Intergenerational Think Tank is our largest one yet. We are thrilled to be offering such a dynamic program that's inspiring Clevelanders to join us for conversation and debate, challenging ideas and inspiration. The Social Justice Institute could not have created our conference and opened the entire program to the community free of charge without the generous support of our sponsors. My dean has named them, but I'm going to name them again, because free of charge without the generous support of sponsors. So, we offer our sincere thanks to our colleagues within the CASE community, the Beamer Schneider Professorship in Ethics, the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, the President's Advisory Council on Minorities, who gave us the largest single grant and sponsorship, and the Schubert Center for Child Studies. We also appreciate Dean Cyrus Taylor, Provost Bud Bazelak, and President Barbara Snyder for their ongoing support of the Social Justice Institute. We thank our community sponsors as well for their vision and dedication to cultivating social justice initiatives in Northeast Ohio. So our gratitude goes to IdeaStream WCPN, the Data in Letson, the Sisters of Charity Foundation, the LGBT Community Center of Greater Cleveland, Olivet Institutional Baptist Church, and the Church of the Covenant, which allowed us to include an additional 300 participants when they agreed to host our keynote address in their beautiful sanctuary. The thoughtfulness and dedication of the SJI staff, our planning team, and each of the volunteers. Can you stand? Because you got it. This doesn't happen because of just Dr. Rhonda. This happens because of the staff, the planning team, the sponsors, the volunteers, including our sign language person here, Ms. Pat, said she would donate this to us. Simply Betsy Company from Community, who are helping this weekend. They all deserve our thanks. So, the Social Justice Institute will continue to press on, presenting meaningful events, funding innovative research, educating the next generation of leaders, and working toward equal access to opportunity for all people. We cannot do this important work without you as well. We hope that you will consider supporting us in our endeavors. Gifts of any size will impact our work and support our signature programs. We can accept, here we go. Everybody know I don't like to do this, but I'm gonna do it. We can accept contributions of cash or checks here today. If you got a hat, take it off. You want to pass it down the pews. Or you can visit our website to donate online. We are honored to provide distinctive educational opportunities for students, scholars, and community members, and we welcome you as you become our partners in the work. So, that's all the preface. Let me jump into my welcome, and so we can get Sister Angela up here. So the theme for our think tank this year is educating for struggle, social justice, empathy, and social transformation. The think tank started last night with the showing of the documentary Finding the Gold Within. Tomorrow, we will feature local and national thought leaders on 3 consecutive plenary sessions. One on empathy, one on social justice, and social transformation is the 3rd. So bridging hearts, minds, and actions, we will discuss, 1, what is empathy? And why is it critical to achieve social justice and transformation? 2, what are some of the most pressing social justice issues of our day? And 3, how are people fighting to challenge inequality in the present day? Our think tank will close with a performance talk by Chilean, by way of New York, hip-hop group Rebel Diaz. One more important social justice matter before I introduce our fabulous speaker for tonight. I must recognize, and I want all of us to know and remember, that we are in a month that marks the anniversaries of 3 tragic deaths. All Black people at the hands of police in Cleveland. On November 13th, 2014, Tanisha Anderson, whose family called for help because she was suffering a mental health crisis, died in a takedown measure after being physically restrained in a prone position at the hands of police in Glenville. Tanisha Anderson was killed on November 13th, 2014. On November 22nd, 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was playing with a toy gun, was shot in less than 2 seconds by police at a gazebo at the Cadell Recreation Center. Community members are currently protesting the way County Prosecutor Tim McGinty is handling the case, including the current grand jury proceedings. The asks are several: that the findings of probable cause issued by Municipal Court Judge Ronald Adrian as the result of citizen affidavits filed by the Cleveland 8 in June be presented to the grand jury. And for full disclosure, I am one of the Cleveland 8, and at least 2 other ones of us are in the audience. And that McGinty step aside or be removed as the prosecutor and replaced with a special prosecutor. Tamir Rice was killed on November 22nd, 2014. And on November 29th, 2012, we suffered the Cleveland atrocity, dubbed so by longtime activist Don Freeman, or what most people might know as the 137 shots where 2 unarmed people, Melissa Williams and Timothy Russell, were killed in a hail of 137 police bullets by 13 officers. No one was convicted. Melissa Williams and Timothy Russell died on November 29th, 2012. A moment of silence. So Sister Angela Y. Davis has said, I think the importance of doing activist work is precisely because it allows you to give back and to consider yourself not as a single individual who may have achieved whatever, but to be a part of an ongoing historical movement. So we are in the midst of a movement, and we need more activists. This evening, in so many ways, it is fitting that we have here with us to give our opening keynote address, Sister Angela Y. Davis. Sister Angela Y. Davis, let's get it out straight. Sister Angela Y. Davis. She has been in the struggle for more than 45 years, more than 45 years. I will not read her biography. It is in your program. What I will say is this, and then turn the stage over to her for real. I've been wanting to bring Sister Angela Davis as a speaker for a long time, y'all, a long time. I've read her autobiography several times, her authored books authored about her. I've seen her in documentaries, Mountains That Take Wing and Free Angela and All Political Prisoners. I even have a poster of a wood carving done in 1970 with a picture of Sister Angela that has captioned, Sister, you are welcome in this house. I have been wanting Sister Angela for a long while, but it was that year. Check this out, see what the universe does. But it was that year that I just happened to see her on an airplane, and I already told her I was going to say this. It was that year I happened to see her on an airplane going to an American Studies Association conference in Puerto Rico that I talked to myself and said, one day I'm bringing her to CWRU. And then a year or so later, I was sitting at Starbucks in Cleveland Heights, outside working, and who did I see? Sister Angela, arriving with family or friends, and they sat 2 tables down. And I said, wow, I didn't bother them. I said, wow, I must be getting closer. I must be getting closer to that day, but not yet. And then, check out the universe. And then I sat right next to her at a book exhibit during the 50th anniversary event by the Social Justice Initiative at University of Illinois Chicago, started by a very good friend, Barbara Ransby, to commemorate Freedom Summer. And we took a selfie which I then ran to the corner and said to my mama. And then months later, I saw her again, and I met her more formally, and I talked with her at the Arcus Center for Social Justice Leadership at Kalamazoo College, where a good friend of ours, Lisa Brock, is the academic director. And I finally asked her, I said, Sister Angela, would you come to speak at the Social Justice Institute at CWRU? And she said, you know, I have family in Cleveland, in the Cleveland area, and sometime during the fall months could work. And Sister Shai, who's around here, who's my institute administrator at the time, we now have Lisa Collins, but Shai and I was like, okay, here we go. And then we talked about self-care, and here we are. So I am so glad we have with us Sister Angela, who has been in the struggle for more than 45 years. Her life has been a testimony to the reality of attacks on Black people and women and anti-imperial, anti-capitalist radicals and thinkers, and who care about the rights and the dignity and the humanity of others. And her life and her struggles have been an example of the strident, vociferous voice and fortitude and hard work and cautions and dangers that come with speaking truth to power. Everyone, here is Sister Angela, who has said you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and then you have to do it all the time. Sister Angela Davis.
That was an introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. It's always a pleasure to visit Cleveland, which has become something like a second home to me since, as Dr. Rhonda pointed out, I have family here. Some of them are sitting on the front row here. And whenever I speak at Case Western Reserve, and I think the last time was perhaps 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 years ago, I'm always reminded that this could have been my alma mater, because I applied to and was accepted at what was then Western Reserve, and I almost came, but I decided to stay on the East Coast. So. But I'd like to thank Dr. Rhonda Williams for having invited me to participate in this biennial think tank of the Social Justice Institute. I understand that the theme this year is Educating for Struggle, Social Justice, Empathy, and Social Transformation. I would like to thank everybody involved in organizing the conference, and I'd like to thank Pat for being the interpreter of the event this evening. Over the last year or so, we've been very much focused on persistent assaults on Black lives in this country, from racial profiling and police violence to the racist institutionalized violence associated with over-incarceration and the prison industrial complex. Of course, these attacks are not new. It's just that the media has been paying more attention to these assaults over the last period in the aftermath of the Ferguson protest, and because young people all over the country are determined to force the media to pay attention, these attacks are not new. And as distressed as we might feel about having to confront new examples of racist violence almost every day, we should remind ourselves that this is what we have been living with, literally living with since the era of slavery. There is an unbroken line of institutional violence inflicted on poor Black communities, poor indigenous communities, poor communities of color since the era of slavery and colonization. Thus, I want to begin with a warning about the need to ward off the always encroaching historical amnesia, which prevents us from understanding the depths of the problems we are confronting. And which therefore urges us to embrace superficial solutions. And then the problem of racism becomes the repressed that repeatedly returns. Not long ago, if you remember, the dominant public discourse argued that the election of Barack Obama and the rise of other Black figures in the hierarchies of economic and political power in this country constituted evidence of the advent of the post-racial. And there was also talk about post-feminism. But I don't think anyone could have argued that we had moved beyond economic equality. I don't remember hearing any discussion about the post-capitalists. But of course, how quickly this argument regarding the post-racial was refuted. Over the last year or so, the Pandora's box of racism has been opened once again. The point is, at this historical conjuncture, we should not rush to shut the box again. But we need to explore the deep causes of persistent racism in this society. Of course, we have to find ways of dealing with immediate pain. With the immediate pain of 12-year-old Tamir Rice's brutal and entirely unnecessary death at the hands of Cleveland police. We've learned from that case that no one, not even a child, is immune when it comes to racist state violence. And we cannot forget Tanisha Anderson, who, as you heard Dr. Rhonda speaking about her case, whose family reached out for help at a time of crisis when they were unable themselves to cope with the consequences of her mental illness. We learned from that case that a mentally ill Black woman encountering the police can sometimes be a lethal predicament. But I don't want to begin with the immediate problems we are confronting. Rather, I want to stage this conversation we're having about social justice, empathy, and transformation by asking you to think about what is happening in other parts of the world. I want to talk about Europe and Africa. And I want to begin by telling you that since 2006, on May 10th, of every year, France has observed what they call a National Day of Remembrance of the slave trade, slavery, and their abolition. They call it Journée nationale des mémoires de la traite, l'esclavage et leur abolition. Now, perhaps you're thinking, how is it that France has such a day? And we here in the United States, who live in a society that continues to be deeply affected by our histories of slavery and racism, have not even begun to discuss the need to create such a day of remembrance. It seems that the only time we engage in widespread popular discussion of slavery is when a new film is released. The last widespread discussion was, of course, in relation to 12 Years a Slave. And the main character was not even a slave for life, only for 12 years. But anyway. And I want to talk a little bit about France. And I just learned, and some of you may have received flashes on your phones as well, that a horrendous attack has occurred in Paris, and that something like 100 people have been killed. And I don't know very much more. But I had planned to speak about France this evening because the city of Nantes, which is on the Loire River, was a major hub of the French slave trade. And you should know that for years and decades, France basically denied involvement in the slave trade. But as it turns out, during the 18th century, from this city alone, something like 1,800 expeditions to Africa were conducted. And ships that came from the city of Nantes transported more than 500,000 men and women to Haiti and other parts of the Caribbean and to the Louisiana coast. In Nantes, along the dock of the Loire, there is now an impressive memorial to the abolition of slavery, which was opened, I believe, in 2012. And of course, there's been controversy, particularly around the fact that Africans and people of African descent were not invited to play a major role in the production of the memorial. But at least there's a memorial. At least there's something around which there is controversy. And I think that it is either the largest or one of the largest memorials to slavery in the world. Memorials are always tricky, though, in the sense that they can occasion forgetfulness. They can occasion amnesia, even as they invite us to engage in exercises of historical memory. This past May 10th, I participated in the ceremonies there of the Day to Remember the Slave Trade, Slavery, and their Abolition. We threw rose petals into the river, into the Loire, and we walked along the dock that is marked by over 1,000 small glass plaques bearing the names of ships that had left Nantes for Africa, and then, of course, the triangular slave trade, and then for the Americas. We walked along the dock toward the podium where the official memorial ceremony was to take place. It was a largely white French crowd that gathered to hear a Black gospel group perform and to listen to the mayor's words. I looked around and I noticed that there was a silent demonstration in progress. Standing along the perimeter of the audience was a group of African men holding placards. And one of them read, "Aucun être humain n'est illégal." That means no human being is illegal. Another placard asked the mayor to provide them with housing and with hope. In my brief talk that afternoon, on May 10th of this year in Nantes, I could not ignore the powerful, silent presence of those men, and I felt compelled to acknowledge the fact that they seemed to be standing there as a reminder that remembering slavery and the slave trade was not enough, or that it was not primarily about remembering the past. And many of you probably know the often repeated quote from William Faulkner, "The past is not dead, it is not even past." So I thought about the past insisting on being acknowledged in its very presence, when I realized that these men, refugees from the Sudan, from Eritrea, from Libya, and various other countries in Africa, who had made their way across the Mediterranean to Nantes, had actually retraced the voyages of the 18th century slave ships from Nantes in reverse. Later, I met with them at the church that had given them temporary refuge. And one of them repeated several times, "The Mediterranean is an African graveyard. The Mediterranean is an African graveyard." In the meantime, the wealth of Nantes, as exhibited through their great mansions, architectural structures that continue to bear witness to the fact that Nantes is what it is only because of the torture and exploitation of African bodies. And of course, if we brought this lesson home, we would say Atlanta is what it is because of the torture and exploitation of African bodies. Washington, D.C. is what it is because of the torture and exploitation of African bodies. And every elite university on the East Coast, from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Brown, they continue to embody the wealth that slavery helped them to produce. The past is not even past. These are complicated times. Over the last year and a half since the protest in Ferguson, we've achieved a broad public consciousness regarding the persistence of racist state violence. If we ask why the world responded so passionately to the killings of Tamir Rice and Mike Brown and Eric Garner and the many others we have learned about this last year and a half, including Tanisha Anderson, Sandra Bland, and the recent South Carolina attack on a young schoolgirl by a school resource officer, the answer must have something to do with the way these technologies of violence have become increasingly familiar to people throughout the world. A schoolgirl is assaulted by a police officer in South Carolina for using her cell phone in class. In the aftermath of the attack on Charlie Hebdo, a young Muslim boy in the banlieue outside Paris refuses to say, "Je suis Charlie," and he is told that if he is not Charlie, then he must be a terrorist. This young boy was arrested. I think he was 8 years old, was arrested by the police. And this is why I fear the consequences of what is happening in Paris at this moment. The millions of deterritorialized people in Africa and the Middle East who are now fleeing to Europe represent the revenge of history. The consequences of slavery and colonization are now being experienced by Greece and Austria and Germany and many other European countries where refugees are heading. But here in the US, we tend to act as if we are totally uninvolved in those massive upheavals. Our historical amnesia is so complete that we fail to acknowledge the role that the US played in dislodging populations in Afghanistan and Libya, populations that are now fleeing to Europe. And it seems to me that the current immigration crisis in Europe should lead us to think more deeply about immigration issues in the United States, and to realize how the discourse on immigrants represented by, I don't even want to say his name, but Donald Trump and other conservatives is so utterly destructive of any notion of social justice. Many immigrants in Europe identify with the movement that is known by the slogan, Black Lives Matter, because they have suffered similar violence at the hands of the police. Immigrants from Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and Africa here in the United States recognize what we might call the intersectionality of state violence. Racist police violence, attacks against trans people of color, violence against prisoners, violence against immigrants. But what is not always acknowledged is that intra-community violence and intimate violence are nourished and reproduced by state violence. You know, why is it that we tend to think about these modes of violence as so entirely separate? That we stand up and speak out against police violence, and we recognize its institutional quality, its institutional character. But when we see young men in our communities killing each other, we think it's their fault. And we don't ask, where did they learn? Where did they learn that disputes could be resolved through violence? I think what we are confronting is an economy of violence, and the symbiotic relationship of different modes of violence: state violence, intimate violence, institutional violence. It thrives on excess violence directed at certain communities. And one such community are communities of trans people of color. And it seems to me that if we reveal these reservoirs of violence and we openly challenge them, it helps to diminish the overall economy of violence. Now, we know, I think, or some of us know, that there's a link between institutional violence and intimate violence. And as a matter of fact, when perpetrators of what is often called domestic violence are simply sent to prison, they often participate in a process that involves the reproduction of violence through the means of putatively addressing violence. And so oftentimes people leave prison much more violent than when they entered. So we know that violence at the hands of the police, violence in prison, often produces gender violence in the so-called free world, violence against LGBTQ communities. But why do we always assume that the daily violence that happens in our communities is totally separate from the violence that comes down from the hierarchies of power and from the apparatuses of the state? Why do we assume that young black people or anyone who engages in violence simply learned it on their own? Where do these ideas come from that encourage us to see violence as a solution? What is the origin of the idea that, for example, disputes within intimate relationships can be addressed by violence on partners? And so, how can one expect to train police officers, prison guards, and soldiers in the use of violence and not have that violence reverberate elsewhere? How is it that here in Cleveland, police could fire 137 rounds at 2 unarmed black people? Who taught them that that was okay? And how can this not reverberate elsewhere? Elsewhere in their lives and in the lives of others. The reliance on police has become so vast in our neighborhoods and communities that we have forgotten how to resolve problems on our own. We do not know how to do anything other than call the police. Call the police. This is something that scholars who do work around abolition issues, Brady Heiner, for example, call conflict sequestration. It means that we do not know how to resolve conflict except by calling the police. We have forgotten. We have become de-skilled. And if we do not know how to resolve conflicts except by calling the police, what do we do if we can't call the police? We impersonate the police. We use violence as we have been taught to use violence. In a sense, you might say that gangs are micro-militaries. So we should know that there is a link between institutional violence, intra-community violence, intimate violence. I'm suggesting that we keep in mind the global and what you might call the quotidian, that we think in large terms, in capacious terms, that we ask how our institutions influence our daily relations, which requires us also to think in smaller terms, in micro terms. So how can we make sense of these global and micro developments? How can our engagement with history help to negotiate these complicated times when freedoms appear to be even more out of reach than they were when slavery was on the verge of being dismantled? If we bring a sense of history to our activist work, and this is, I think, precisely what the Social Justice Institute is about, we bring an array of questions. The meaning of freedom. Since the role of slavery has hardly been resolved in the last several centuries, why do we assume that we have sort of handily moved from slavery to freedom, to quote the title of John Hope Franklin's amazing book? As if slavery as a discrete institution can be comfortably relegated to a past which has been overcome in what I would call the one-dimensional freedom of the post-slavery era. The most interesting 19th century anti-slavery abolitionists did not think that they could bring down slavery simply by declaring it over. Proclamations might have been helpful, but proclamations could not end slavery. Amendments to the constitutions, okay, but they could not end slavery. The only hope of truly ending slavery was to begin to embark on a long, very long process of purging existing institutions of racism and creating new ones that would allow for the production of a very different kind of democracy from the democracy associated with the founding fathers. A democracy that would allow former slaves to be incorporated on a basis of equality, on an egalitarian basis, would not have been the same democracy it was, based on excluding people of color, excluding indigenous people, excluding women. And so this is what they called abolition democracy. And abolition democracy was a process that unfortunately was abruptly ended with the downfall of radical Reconstruction over 130 years ago. So we still need our radical Reconstruction. During the last 100 years, racism has become so thoroughly embedded in the country's economic, political, and educational system, so thoroughly embedded in the collective psyche of people in this country. This is why, incidentally, it was so bizarre that there were those who assumed that all you had to do was elect a black president and you were ushered into the post-racial. And so it seems that this process of abolishing slavery and all of the vestiges of slavery is going to be even more difficult than it would have been had we begun immediately in the aftermath of slavery, had we continued along the trajectory of radical Reconstruction. But I want to say that abolition democracy is still possible. John Hope Franklin, who was interviewed by Manning Marable in 1998, and Manning said to him, "You've gone through this experience with the initiative." You know, John Hope Franklin was the chair of President Clinton's initiative on race. I think Clinton thought that all he needed was a year of conversations, but I won't go into that. And besides, it was Lonnie Guinier who was the one who came up with the idea of a conversation on race anyway. But Manning Marable said, "You've studied the life and historical experience of the African American people. What we've had to confront in this country fundamentally is a system of racial inequality. Can racism be dismantled in this country based on your experience? How optimistic are you that we can one day triumph over racism?" Now, this was John Hope Franklin, and this is the year of his centenary. He would have been 100 this year. So what did he say? John Hope Franklin said, "I am cautiously optimistic. But if I were not optimistic, I would jump out of the window or something because I couldn't stand it." So we have to be optimistic, and there's no alternative but to be optimistic. Yeah, like Antonio Gramsci said, even though we may be pessimistic with respect to the intellect, with respect to the will, we have to be optimistic. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. But John O. Franklin says, I believe in the redemption of man, the rehabilitation of man. I believe that it is entirely possible to overcome the awful, awful difficulties we've had in this country. I think it will take a long time, and I'm willing to fight for the long haul. The historian is not of the opinion that this will happen in his lifetime. And we need more historians among us. A more historical-minded people among us. And I take seriously his call for a more historical-minded people. We have many wonderful historians, including Dr. Rhonda Williams, and she mentioned Barbara Ransby, and Robin D.G. Kelley, and Tara Hunter. I can go on. But I don't know whether we have yet a historical-minded people. And I want to tell you that just not long ago, speaking of history and historical mindedness, I walked through the reconstructed historical city of St. Mary's City, which is in Maryland, St. Mary's City. It was the first colonial settlement in Maryland. And so I was walking through this State House, and in the back, I saw reminders that jails and prisons, which we tend to see as permanent features of our society, are actually relatively new to human history. So we have to develop the habit of thinking beyond our lifetimes and become historical-minded. What I saw there were the old forms of punishment, the stocks and the pillory, which should remind us that if they were superseded along with other forms of corporal punishment as routine aspects of quotidian life, then jails and prisons should also be considered impermanent. We should be capable of finding other ways of addressing the problems that jails and prisons purport to solve. We should be capable of finding solutions that are less damaging to our communities. Last spring, the New York Times had a report that was entitled 1.5 Million Missing Black Men. And it opened with these observations. In New York, almost 120,000 black men between the ages of 25 and 54 are missing from everyday life. In Chicago, 45,000 are, and more than 30,000 are missing in Philadelphia. Across the South, from North Charleston, South Carolina, through Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, and up into Ferguson, Missouri, hundreds of thousands more are missing. They are missing, and I'm continuing to read the quote, largely because of early deaths or because they are behind bars. Remarkably, black women who are 25 to 54 and not in jail outnumber black men in that category by 1.5 million. For every 100 black women in this age group living outside of jail, there are only 83 black men. Among whites, the equivalent number is 99, near parity. The report emphasizes that more than 1 out of every 6 black men who should be between the ages of 25 and 54 are missing from daily life. They have suffered death by violence or civil death by imprisonment. The fact that the death penalty continues to be used as a routine form of punishment, the only real questions revolving around the most humane death-producing chemicals. The fact that the death penalty continues to be used as a routine form of punishment can only be explained by the persistence of structures of slavery. There is the death penalty and what Brian Stevens calls the other death penalty. That is to say, life without possibility of parole. So for those of you who might still be thinking that life without possibility of parole is a viable alternative to the death penalty, think about this. Life without possibility of parole is a sentence to die in prison. It is a death sentence. It is certainly true that men constitute the vast majority of people in prison throughout the country and the world. But people often forget to ask how women and girls are affected by the phenomenon of over-incarceration. First, women still constitute the fastest growing sector of the imprisoned population. Second, women suffer the collateral consequences of over-incarceration. Who makes the visits? Who pays for the collect telephone calls? Who has to suffer the overpayment of collect telephone calls because it is often more expensive to make a collect call from prison than it is right outside of the prison in the so-called free world. Although many scholars and activists have insisted over the decades that race is always gendered and gender is always race, there's still the tendency to consider race as gender neutral and gender as race neutral. And so the Black Lives Matter campaign has had to insist that Black lives be considered in all of their various specificities. Black women, Black girls, Black lesbians, Black gay men, Black trans women, Black differently abled people, etc. And of course, the police killing of Tanisha Anderson in Cleveland and Miriam Carey in Washington emphasized that Black women are targets of racist state violence. And if that didn't convince us, then the video footage of a school resource officer taking down a schoolgirl who was apparently subject to discipline because she used her cell phone in class is further evidence of the way race and gender intersect in very violent ways. The low level of intelligence with respect to the way racism functions in our society was exhibited by the sheriff of Richland County, who indicated that he had fired the school resource officer, Ben Fields, for attacking the girl in such a brutal manner. But he said he didn't think that racism had anything to do with it. Since the officer had a Black girlfriend. You see what I mean about the low level of intelligence with respect to, that is indicative of a low level of intelligence in the country as a whole. So many people have asked me during this period whether I'm excited that after decades of failure to acknowledge the prison crisis and racial profiling, et cetera, suddenly it seems that everybody is turning their attention in the direction of mass incarceration. Now, this also includes the Republican candidates It also includes figures like Newt Gingrich and Grover Norquist, who have created an organization they call the Right on Crime. Everyone is jumping on the bandwagon of resisting mass incarceration. But I'm concerned. I'm happy that finally, it seems, this is a topic of conversation that can generate some energy, but I'm afraid that there will simply be calls for reform. And the calls for reform may ultimately have the effect of strengthening the very system we thought we were contesting. Thus, we cannot simply call for reform of the police. We cannot simply call for reform of jails and prisons. Incidentally, the history of jails and prisons is a history of reform. From the very beginning, and each era of reform which holds such hope ends up creating a more repressive institution. We know now that law enforcement and punishment industries are very much linked to forces that have very little to do with making our communities safe. Why are U.S. police trained in Israel, as we learned in the aftermath of Ferguson last year? Why are they becoming increasingly militarized? The militarization of the police compels us to think about the extent to which the so-called war on terror has affected the behavior of the police, and the Islamophobia that impels the war on terror has helped to strengthen and complicate the racism with which we have been so familiar. Racialized mass incarceration represents the profitability of punishment. And I'm waiting to hear someone talk about over-incarceration, racialized over-incarceration as a central strategy of global capitalism, as a strategy of managing bodies of color and immigrant and refugee bodies wherever they may be. As prison abolitionists have pointed out, the prison industrial complex produces these bodies as garbage, as detritus, as disposable, and in the meantime, create the ideological illusion that once you lock them up, once you warehouse them, once you lock them away, the surrounding society is more free and safer because all the dangerous black people have been locked up. And in the meantime, corporations profit and poor communities suffer. Education suffers. Healthcare suffers. And it should also be pointed out that countries like Israel use the carceral technologies developed by the prison industrial complex not only to control the thousands of Palestinians who are behind bars, but also to control the everyday life of people in the so-called free world, of Palestinians who live on the West Bank, in Gaza, and inside Israel. So just as we affirm connections between slavery and the prison industrial complex, we also emphasize the link between anti-slavery abolition and anti-prison, anti-police abolition. We learn a great deal about what should be on our social and political agendas today, but by looking at what was not achieved in the aftermath of slavery, the abolition democracy about which I was speaking, which still remains to be established today. What those who advocated an abolition democracy in the 19th century understood was the interconnectedness between the negative aspect of abolition, the elimination of the institution of slavery, and the positive aspect of abolition, the creation of a new democracy with new institutions that make it possible for former slaves and today for racially marginalized people to participate in an egalitarian way in the institutions of economic, social, and political life. Therefore, anti-prison abolition attempts to accomplish what anti-slavery abolition failed to achieve. It takes up issues of mass incarceration and the way race and gender structure the prison industrial complex, but it also addresses the unresolved issues of jobs and education and healthcare that have been looming over our society since the putative abolition of slavery. And so therefore, I conclude by suggesting that as we attempt to address the repeated racist assaults, police assaults on our community, we call for the demilitarization of the police. But also, we have to learn how to say what we want, even if we believe that it is impossible to achieve at the moment. Because if we do not indicate what we want, we ultimately forget what our aspirations were. And so I say we call for the demilitarization of the police, and we begin to call for the disarming of the police. The disarming of the police. As well as the disarming of everybody else. There are over 300 million guns in this country. If we get rid of all of those guns, then the police would not need guns either. And we called for the abolition of the institution of the police as we know it, and new ways of imagining safety and security that do not rely on violence. And of course, we also called for the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment, the abolition of jails and prisons and immigrant detention facilities. But then, this would only be the beginning of a struggle to reconceptualize, reinvent, and recreate our societies. Thank you very much.
Okay, So we're going to have just a short time of moderated dialogue. I just have a couple questions to kind of get us started. I don't know that I need to warm this audience up. I'm sure you have plenty of questions. So I'm just going to ask a couple, and then you have a mic on either side. If you would come up to the mic, I'll give you the signal so you're not standing up there, and we'll get the dialogue going, okay? So my first question, again, thank you again for that fabulous talk, very thought-provoking, very inspiring, engaging, and disturbing, and it should be disturbing in terms of what it compels us to think about. In my opening remarks, I provided a quote attributed to you, and I'm gonna read it again. I think the importance of doing activist work is precisely because it allows you to give back and to consider yourself not as a single individual who may have achieved whatever, but to be a part of an ongoing historical movement. And so I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about how social justice requires us to move beyond our individual experiences and empathize with others to make change? So we seem to be some of us a little stuck, the individual.
Yeah. You know, after all, this is really the era of possessive individualism. When we talk about neoliberal discourse and global capitalism, and one of the major challenges, it seems to me, is to figure out how to resist that assumption that we are only or primarily individuals. And we might talk about this in terms of who changes, who makes radical change historically? Who are historical agents? And of course, as a historian, you know that there's the school that thinks that it's like great white men change history, right? And then it becomes great black men. Because we often think of the civil rights movement as a movement that was created by Dr. Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. And Dr. King was wonderful, and we should have the reverence that we have for him, but we should also recognize that it was masses of people who brought about that change. And also individualism is, there's a masculinist character to individualism. So it's oftentimes the women who get erased. And so it's still important to insist in this country that what we call the civil rights movement, excuse me, would not have been successful had it not been for women. And I never tire of pointing out that if it were not for poor black women, if it were not for black women domestic workers, we would not be where we are today. And so it means that we have to figure out how to experience the joy of feeling a part of something larger. How to experience that collective passion, and how to recognize that if we are associated with communities of struggle, we can be a part of upheavals that will change the course of history. And I think we're at one of those historical conjunctures at this very moment. So that lesson, I don't know when I said that, but it sounds like me.
Yeah.
So
that's good. I was hoping you would say, I didn't say that, Dr. Rhonda. Yeah. So,
well, I can claim it. I can claim it as a collective insight.
Can you talk a little bit about empathy? This is a word that, a lot of folks like empathy. It's namby-pamby. It's like, what are we talking about? Empathy. Like, why is that important? Why is it one of the themes of your conference? I mean, how do you think about empathy? How do you define empathy? How do you think about it? Why do you think it's important, or do you think it's important to our ability to even engage in social justice and social transformation struggles?
Yeah, I'm very glad that you chose empathy as one of the terms to stage the conversations of this think tank. Because without empathy, it seems one remains imprisoned in one's own consciousness. And we are social beings. We are not primarily individuals. We are individuals, and individuality is wonderful. But I think that individualism militates against individuality. I think that individuality flourishes best in collective circumstances. And empathy is an important aspect of that. And empathy, not only a one-way empathy, but a kind of mutual empathy. And I can draw from my own experiences, and I can tell you that many years ago, you said that I had spent 45 years, and it's a lot longer than that.
Okay,
I have to tell you. I think it's more like 60 years.
All right, I'm 60.
Yeah, it's more like 60.
60.
Because when people asked me when I first became involved in the movement, I said, well, when I was 11 years old, I was active in an interracial discussion group at my church. And the church was actually burned as a result of the fact that we were conducting these conversations. I was 11 years old then, so I guess you can do the math.
Yeah. I was going to leave a little mystery.
But what I was going to say is that people often ask me how I was able to address the really difficult circumstances many years ago when I was on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, and I thank you for the applause. And when I was in jail, charged with 3 capital crimes, 3 capital offenses. It meant that I could have been sent to the gas chamber in California. That's what California had during those days. And so people often ask me, well, how did you deal with that? And if I try to remember what it was like, what strikes me most is that I kept telling myself that I was not alone. And I knew that there were people organizing around the demand for my freedom. And so, of course I was afraid. Anybody would be afraid under those circumstances, but at the same time I felt that I had a great deal of hope, because there were people all over the world who were empathizing with me, who were there with me, and who were in the courtroom with me during my trial. And I'll never forget that. And I meet people many, many years later who, all over the world, who tell me, oh, I was at a demonstration. I had one of those posters that said, "Sister, you are welcome in my house." I signed a petition. I wrote you a letter, and it's still, to me, it's just so enlivening, and it makes me feel connected with people. I'll tell you just one story, because I could go on for the next hour talking about these experiences. But I was in Palestine a few years ago, and I pointed out that I was giving a talk, and I said, well, when I was in jail, I received a message of solidarity from Palestinian prisoners who somehow were able to smuggle the message out, and then it made its way across the ocean to me, and it was brought into my cell. And so I said how deeply connected it made me feel with people that I didn't know. I had no idea how they looked. No, all I knew was that they were in prison. And at one point during that visit, this man came up to me and he said, I just want to tell you, I was one of the prisoners who signed that message of solidarity. And so I think we need to use empathy not only to feel connected to those who are in our communities, those with whom we have physical connection, but empathy to feel connected to people who are struggling all over the world.
Thank you. So now you mentioned 11 years old. How many young people in the room 11 or younger? Stand up. Give these young people. How many younger than 18? 18 and younger in the stand. Yes. So oftentimes, adults sometimes don't even think they can make a difference, let alone young people. And 11 years old, you are already activating. What message would you give to young people about the possibility and the power that they have to engage in social transformation and social justice?
Well, I think young people are finding their way. And I'm not one who likes to preach to young people. But I like to encourage, I like to observe, I like to learn from. Because every major movement has been created by and led by young people. And we often forget to come back to the US and the freedom movement that we call the civil rights movement. We often forget that one of the major turning points was the Children's Crusade, when children left school and decided that they wanted to confront the police and the fire hoses and the dogs. And it was at that moment that images circulated all over the world and produced this amazing solidarity for people who were struggling for freedom in the southern United States of America.
So I have one more question, and we can start lining up at the mics. What advice from experience or just things we need to kind of think about would you give people about how do we build and sustain or attempt to build and sustain a movement? And what's the difference between a movement and an action, and a movement and going to a rally or a march? Or I mean, how do we build and sustain a movement?
Well, I think it's important to go to rallies, it's important to participate in actions, but one cannot assume that that is a movement that will have staying power. For me, a movement is precisely about the connections we've been talking about. When we feel connected to one another through our aspirations for social justice. And demonstrations demonstrate the existence of that connection, of those communities of struggle. And so we work on building movements not only in organizing the actions, but creating the consciousness. We work on building movements wherever we are. Oftentimes it's assumed that to be an activist, you have to spend your whole life in meetings, you know? And some people, they love social justice, but they hate meetings.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so there have to be ways for everybody to participate. Artists, I think the role of artists is always underestimated. Because artists, musicians, poets, visual artists, filmmakers can show us the way before we even have the discursive language to say what it is that we want. And so I would say that building movements is about using whatever talents or whatever skills or whatever passions one might have to encourage the development of these communities of struggle, of this consciousness. And it should be, well, now of course we have social media, and that is very good because it means that we can connect with each other when we need to, but oftentimes we assume that the only possible connection is through social media. And so I always say we often allow the technology to use us, as opposed to figuring out how we can best use the technology to create our movements.
So I know we must have some questions, and mic on either side. And as people are making their way, I'm sorry, I got one more, because this is critical. My students tell me this, and they remind me, and I remind my students. Can you talk a little bit about why self-care, because this is one of the things we talked about, why self-care is so important for social struggle? And just individual health, humanity.
Well, I'll stand up for a minute. Well, if we can't care for ourselves, how can we care for a movement? And so what we have to recognize that that if we commit to this struggle for social justice, it should be a long-term commitment. It shouldn't be a commitment for a year, or 2 years, or 10 years. It should be, I was talking about John Hope Franklin, who I guess was in his 80s or so when he said that he was in it for the long haul. And I think we all have to be in it for the long haul. And we have to try to imagine how coming generations are going to benefit from the work that we do today, just as we definitely benefit from the work that generations of people before us were able to do. So self-care, self-care is about taking care of oneself. The body, we have to care for the body. We have to respect the body. And if we respect the body, we question the way in which capitalism presumes to tell us how to nourish our bodies with food that is often disease-producing at the same time as it is profit-producing. So I think one of the next great movements is going to be around food justice. Which means that in order to engage in self-care, we have to develop conscious habits of consciousness, conscious eating. So people often ask me, well, since you're a vegan, do you go out and proselytize? And I say, no, I don't proselytize. I don't proselytize about anything. Not even social justice, because I think people have to figure out how to ask the questions that will allow them to find their own way into the struggle. And so with respect to eating, it's always about conscious eating, asking questions about how the food was produced, right? Asking questions about the workers who are responsible for producing that food. So there's a whole range of questions that have to do with that. And then I think we have to engage in a kind of mindfulness. And I think meditation is really important. We're learning increasingly how important meditation is for the body and for the soul. And so practices like the practice of yoga is often considered to be an individual practice. So I want us to think about how we can make some of these spiritual practices collective practices, how we can incorporate them into our social justice movements. And I know that many young people in the Black Lives Matter campaign, in many of the organizations like Dream Defenders and We Charge Genocide and Black Youth Project, that they incorporate this consciousness about the need for self-care into the organizing work. So it has to be holistic. We can't assume that we can be in favor of prison abolition, but at the same time have impulses, the unquestioned impulses that basically incorporate the work of the state in our social relations. So when we become angry and want to harm someone because we think that person has harmed us, what are we doing but reproducing the very retributive impulse that we challenge when we say we want an end to mass incarceration? So self-care is about a holistic approach. And I think I better end there because I have too much more to say.
So we're going to go back and forth. We can start a question over here. We'll go over here, and we'll go back and forth.
Thank you for hosting this, Dr. Rhonda, and for the Social Justice Institute, and for Professor Davis for being here. My question is, I'd like to hear your thoughts a little bit more on Palestine and particularly the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. There's been some debate that maybe that is the be-all, end goal of the movement. So I was wondering, how can we deepen ties and solidarities with Palestine?
Well, I think, especially for people in the U.S., it's important to develop an internationalist consciousness. Because in the U.S., we are encouraged to believe that whatever gets produced in this country, even radical activism, is the best of the best. And we don't realize how much we can learn from other people and other places, and especially from people who are struggling around justice for Palestine. And I'm talking about Palestinians. I'm talking about Jewish people in Israel who are also involved in the campaign for Palestine solidarity. And I think that for us in this country, it's really important to figure out how to address, for example, charges of anti-Semitism, which are often launched in response to discussions about Palestine. And what we have to point out is that we're against racism, and anti-Semitism is a kind of racism. So obviously we are as passionately opposed to anti-Semitism as we stand for justice in Palestine. The BDS movement follows the trajectory of the South African movement. And just as it was a global boycott that helped to create the conditions that eventually led to the downfall of apartheid, they are hoping that the BDS campaign will create conditions that will make justice more possible in Palestine. For us, in this country, it's important because of the prison connection and because of the fact that many of the corporations that are involved in the prisons there, that are involved in the checkpoints and all of the carceral technologies are very much linked to the production of carcerality in this country, and particularly to the technologies of punishment. They're often produced by corporations that are headquartered in the US or that have US affiliates. So when we think about the largest security corporation in the world, G4S, we make those connections. So we do it for ourselves as well as, that's what solidarity is about. It's about recognizing the connections.
Good evening, family. I say family because we are family. I wanted to bring light to a population that is often overlooked, at least in Cleveland, for what I know. My name is Kevin E. Gilmore, and I grew up in foster care here. I went to college because I needed a place to stay when after my first year I was homeless and sleeping in a car. It took me 7 years to finish undergrad. Now I'm not saying it because I want anybody's sympathy, but we're talking about empathy. And Maxie Jackson says we need to empathize in action, right? My population, 36% of kids who age out of care go to prison. 2% of them go to college. 71% of the women who age out of foster care will be a mom before she's 21. The Department of Children and Family Services encourages youth who age out of care to apply for welfare and to live in CMHA housing. They're predominantly African American. So what happens is, after the lawyers, the doctors, the judges, the social workers, the foster parents, and the adoptive parent that waited for them gets paid, they have a lifestyle, a lifetime of poverty because they're living in low-income housing and they're applying for welfare, and only 2% graduate from college. I wanted to know what was your take on that population and what can we do collectively, Clevelanders, with that population? Because, and I forgot to mention, the population is being human trafficked because they have nowhere to go, and whether they're couch surfing or laying down, they're dying daily because they were put in a system that failed them.
Well, first of all, I really want to thank you for raising the question of foster care. Thank you. And personally, I feel very moved by what you say because my mother was a foster child. And my mother actually did go to college, but it was only because she was, you know, I always wondered, how did she manage to do that? But I think it must have been because she was encouraged by teachers. And as a matter of fact, she ran away from her foster family in order to be able to go to high school because she was supposed to get a job, right, after elementary school. But she moved from the country in Alabama to Birmingham and did domestic work, was able to pay for a room at the YWCA, and went to high school. And so I think you're absolutely right that the system fails those whom it should support the most. Oftentimes we talk about families as if they were the be-all, end-all, and I'm very blessed to have a wonderful family, and I know many of us are blessed to have wonderful families, but oftentimes families produce violence. Families are havens for violence. And so therefore there has to be something other than a biological family to provide hope for people who grow up in this society. And I think you're absolutely right. Your statistics reveal the extent to which that entire population of children has been, basically forgotten and dismissed and underestimated. And so I'm glad to hear. I think you must be doing work in that area. And I think more people should join you. What's your name? What? Stephanie? Kevany Gilmore. So if anybody wants to join Kevany, she's right up here.
So we'll go over here. We want to get as many questions in as we can.
All right.
Someone let me there watch.
Okay.
So if we could ask the question and Sister Angela will answer as many.
Okay, first of all, hi, Miss Davis. I just want to tell you that ever since I was 15, when you were going through that struggle, you were a very powerful inspiration to me, and you've been a big part of who I have become. And I want to commend you because that day that Mr. O'Reilly tricked you onto his show, I was empathizing with you at that moment. And I was like, get up, Angela, and you did. You got up and left, Thank you.
Well, the funny thing is that after that show, he called me and wanted to invite me to come on the show again. And he said, this time I'll let you say what you want to say. Right?
Yeah, okay.
No thanks.
Okay.
Now, the second question. Do I think that women's rights will be better or worse? Well, it's actually hard to predict. And I don't like predicting. I like talking about what we can do to make change. So what I will say is that if we do the work that we are supposed to do, things will be a lot better for coming generations of girls, women, trans women. And so I think that we have to act as if it were possible to change the world. Sometimes it's not, it doesn't work out the way we planned, But even if it doesn't work out the way we planned, we do have an impact on the world, and something has changed. And I often say that when I was a young activist, we were convinced that the revolution was just right around the corner. I mean, we knew that, and when I say revolution, I'm talking about anti-capitalist revolution, anti-racist, all of that, that was just going to be a couple of years away. And we acted with that kind of urgency. That revolution, we weren't successful in that revolution, but we were successful in other revolutions. The world would not be the same today had we not acted with such passion and such urgency at that time. Okay, now the last question, feminism. I think feminism is a really important framework. It's a way to see the world. And I like your question, because for me, it's not a question of gender, although feminists do stand up for gender equality, absolutely. And when we say gender equality, we have a much broader notion of what constitutes gender than we used to, because we used to think only in two terms, male, female. Now we know that gender is a huge, vast spectrum is a good word. Yeah, but spectrum and trajectory, because it changes. It's not just an existing spectrum. It's that we cannot even imagine what gender identifications are going to be 100 years from now. So I think we have to account for what we do not yet know. And that has to be incorporated. And I know I'm using words that are too big for you to understand. Did you get what I meant? No. Okay. Okay. Let me see. Feminism is about changing the world. Changing the world. Feminism is about abolishing racism. Feminism is about getting rid of gender inequality. Does that make sense? Yeah? When I say feminism is about radically changing the world, does that make sense? What, is there a word that you don't understand? What is the word you don't understand?
Radical.
Okay, radical. Okay, what does radical mean? I learned from my mentor many years ago that radical means, and I've repeated this a million times, understanding things at the root. Not just the surface, not just what appears to be, but going deeper. Get that? Great, good. Thank you so much for your questions. And how many more do you have?
Dr. Rhonda and Dr. Davis, I'd like to thank you all for having us here. This only reminds me of Montgomery, Alabama, when I was a child. This is how we changed things. We came in a building that was a church. We did not have to go to the streets every time. And I really commend you for saying things that relate not just to people, but to know that we work through a God. And my favorite prayer is the serenity prayer. God, give me the serenity to accept the things that I can change, and the courage to change that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Dr. Davis, I quote you, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. How do you speak to Cleveland to tell us that we are not going to have our city demilitarized, and that we have to speak up because the NRC is here. They are not coming. And if we don't speak for demilitarizing our city, Cleveland will have more ammunition to blow us all past the lake to Canada.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'll just refer you to what I was saying during my talk, that, you know, sometimes we have to be unrealistic. You know, we're always asking ourselves to be realistic. Now, I'm not sure what's going to be happening in Cleveland around the NRC, and I don't even, I probably shouldn't even make any comments about the Republic. But isn't it? I mean, can you believe it's like this is a farce, don't you think? And I mean, I said I didn't want to talk about electoral politics, but I hear Donald Trump, and then I hear Ben Carson. Anyway. That is why we have to begin to ask for the impossible, because the norm has become so impossible that we have to figure out how to get ourselves out of this rut, where even political discourse has so flattened and has become a caricature of itself, that it's difficult to even engage in serious discussion around the issues that matter to us. So let's try to develop the habit of figuring out what it is we really want, and saying what we really want. And I know you have a police commission here. Yeah. And, you know, many years ago, I was involved with an organization, and we did the same kind of work. It was right after my trial was over, National Alliance Against Racism, Political Repression, and we did work against police violence. And one of the things we came up with was to call not for a police review commission, because that assumes that the police are going to engage in the kind of behavior that will need reviewing. So what we decided to call for was a police control commission, so that community people would have, and this was back in the 70s, community people would have the ability to dictate the behavior of the police in the first place, not simply to ask whether they did right or wrong after the fact. And so, yeah, I think you need to have, but you also need people to sit on the police commission. I know you are. That's why I said that, and you are too, right? Because we have to use all of the arenas we can use, wherever we are. There's no one privilege point from which to engage in social justice struggles. We have to create arenas of struggle wherever we are, whether it be in the corporate world, or whether it be in education, or whether it be in at the workplace and organizing unions. We didn't even talk about labor today. And that's especially given the fact that the rise in the numbers of people in prison has been directly correlated with the decline in the numbers of people who are members of labor unions in this country.
Hi, Ms. Davis. My name's Anthony, and I would like to say I've had a crush on you since I was like 11 years old. So I can't believe I'm actually standing here about to ask this question. But you spoke on creativity, and I'm one of the few black active street artists in Cleveland, and thank you.
I saw you jump up when I said artists.
Right.
Yeah.
And I noticed something amongst my people. And when I speak on my people, I speak on the black community, that we don't push our children to be creative. We push our children to be everything else, but once they step into a creative world and they want to pursue an art career, or pursue even music career, they get shunned upon like you're not going to make it. But when, we make it, everybody's there to cheer you on. But it's like, my question to you is, do you think the lack of creativity that is forced, that's not forced in our community, is why a part of where we are today?
Well, I think that may be a way to formulate it. What is humanity about if not creativity? And I think all of us have to recognize the creative dimensions of ourselves. Some of us cultivated that creativity, others of us did not. Some go on to do that creativity full time, and we all benefit from that. But yeah, what you're talking about is the pressures of a society that insists that that money is the most important of all, human creations. And when it comes down to it, what is money? Of course, it buys us comfort, it buys us, but beyond a certain point, what can it do? And I think it's artists who give us a sense of how connected we are, and give us possibilities of experiencing joy. I don't think anybody ever experienced joy just because of money, right? Yeah, you might be happy for a minute, but artists help us to remember who we are as human beings, and help us to remember what really matters in life and in the world. So thank you so much for your work, and I hope you continue.
Thank you.
Okay, and this is the last question.
Okay. Well, Ms. Davis, you have highlighted several times the plague that exists in various ways as a result of the white capitalist patriarchy system that exists not only in this country, but still in large part echoes around the world. And since I've been little, I've of course heard and I'm sure you'll be hearing plenty of this with the Republicans, oh no, China's going to take over, we got to resist, China's going to be the one to take over. And it seemed to make sense to me that, okay, China and India have some pretty huge populations. In my lifetime, yeah, maybe the US isn't going to be the #1 economy in the world. Hey, maybe that's not such a bad thing. Hey, maybe the white males in this country starting to realize that, oh, this is what it's like to be a minority, may not be such a bad thing. To me, the notion of, perhaps in my lifetime, maybe in the next decade or so, China being the one that's on top of the world, may not be such a bad thing. I'm curious if you've reflected on what it might be like when China and India take over the world.
Well, I would hope that they do not model their behavior after the United States of America. And I would also hope that we reach the point where we recognize that it's not all about markets, it's not all about capital, but it is about creating better possibilities for people all over the world to live a joyous and sustained life. And there's so much we can learn from China. There's so much we can learn from India. There's so much we can learn. And of course, there's a lot to learn from the US and from the history of the US. But the assumption that one country, one nation, has to be in control of the planet is absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. So what I would hope is that we learn how to move beyond the notion of the nation state. So many of the problems we are confronting today have to do with the fact that we only imagine the nation state as the unit of life, of social and political life in the world. And I don't happen to believe that the nation state has a good history of providing people with what they need to live decent lives. So what I would hope is that we begin to move beyond nationalism, that we begin to move beyond the nation state, that we learn how to count citizenship not as citizenship of a nation, but a citizenship of the world, citizenship of a world that is increasingly infused with justice. Thank you very much.
Sister Angela Davis. So this concludes our opening keynote. We will see you all in the morning, Ford Auditorium. We have 3 great plenaries, and we're going to close it out with Rebel Diaz. Come and join us for the whole day tomorrow. Ford Auditorium. Thank you very much.